You've spent most of your adult life in law enforcement. What sections or what periods of
You bet.
time have you spent in what divisions?
Yes, ma'am. So, of course, after graduating high school in 1992, I went to Sul Ross State University. I only lasted a semester, and not I didn't fail out, but I was studying law enforcement there. And let me back up just a bit further. Since the first grade, I knew I'd be in law enforcement. I took some sort of little aptitude test where you fill in the ovals, put it into a computer, and it spit out that I'll be a public servant, law enforcement. So I've just known my whole life. And of course, growing up around here, I had a grandfather that was a sheriff. He wasn't my blood grandfather; it's my cousin's grandfather, but he's still granny and granddad. Of course, the Border Patrol station here growing up, I played on their softball team, cut their grass, helped with odd jobs.
Hmm.
But I went to Sul Ross, and then I joined the United States Air Force, and I was stationed actually in Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo. When I went into the Air Force, I knew I wanted to go into the security police, and the recruiter said, dime a dozen, it won't be a problem. I get the basic training, and they offer me all medical career field jobs. So this is, and my whole life's been God's plan for me. I mean, every step of the way. So I just choose a job. I get stationed in San Angelo. I meet my wife. Um, my career field ends up being overmanned. They're not kicking people out. However, I took the Border Patrol test and passed it. So they let me out of my commitment a year early. And then I started my career in the United States Border Patrol in 1996. I started out in Arizona, Nogales, Arizona. That was ground zero at that time. Arizona was and Nogales was the busiest station for illegal alien apprehensions as well as drug seizures, predominantly marijuana.
Hmm.
Like every Texan, I had to get back home to Texas, and I I got back home, and then I ended up going back to Arizona for a promotion, but ended up in Washington D.C. on a couple of tours, um, and then made it back here to Sanderson about 15 years ago as the patrol agent in charge. And I spent the last 11 of my 26 years in the U.S. Border Patrol as the patrol agent in charge of the Sanderson Border Patrol Station. And then 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, God had another change in my life, and unfortunately, our sheriff passed away, Santiago Gonzalez Jr. He had been a 30-year veteran of the United States Border Patrol. Um, I jokingly say no one else was dumb enough to want the job, but I took the job, but I took it for a very specific reason. So, growing up here in Sanderson, I was raised by my grandmother, and every family in this community treated me as if I was one of their own. So, I truly had a lot to give back. And that's what I've been doing ever since. Of course, you're familiar with Sanderson. Terrell County is the 10th largest county in the state of Texas, but we only have a population of about 700 people. And there's really, truly no crime here. It's all our biggest threats, the border security. But when I say threat, it just means that's what keeps us the busiest. The vast majority of people we encounter are no different than you or I. We do encounter some that will have criminal records from time to time, but again, the vast majority are just people that are why we have U.S. Border Patrol. They're coming to work. They're going to places like Santa Maria, California to pick strawberries. They're going to Dallas, Fort Worth to get in construction, Houston to work in the oil industry.
And being from Sanderson, having essentially a whole lifetime there, have you just personally seen Border Patrol practices change within your lifetime? I'm assuming they have certain phases, just like any government
Most definitely.
agency.
Most definitely. Of course, when the Border Patrol was originally established, it wasn't established because we had a lot of people from Mexico coming over. There was actually other countries. China was using parts of the border down around Tijuana to come in. Of course, we had prohibition, so there were numerous things that necessitated for America to secure its borders. And then it progressed, into people from obviously Mexico looking to come to the United States for work. But growing up here, the Border Patrol station was about 4 or 5 agents. And again, predominantly their main job was illegal immigration. We were part of the Department of Justice Immigration and Naturalization Service, even when I went into Border Patrol in 1996. And again, immigration was our main focus. Of course, 9/11 happens. Um, we're taken out of the Department of Justice. We're put into the newly formed Department of Homeland Security and become part of Customs and Border Protection. And we're no longer just immigration focused. We're all threats focused. Anything bad that crosses that border, whether it's people, goods, drugs, whatever it may be, our job is to interdict that. And again, primarily what we continue to do is interdict people from other countries, and it's no longer just people from Mexico. Of course, as we saw under the Biden administration, people from all over the world, and even before Biden, people from all over the world exploit the vulnerable U.S. Mexico border because it's still you're still able to cross successfully, make it in the United States and get mixed into regular American life, if you will.
Of course, the most prominent concern right now that a lot of people are having nationally is that bulldozers and contractors and excavators have all been seen in, flocking to these areas to eventually soon begin construction. Um, I know that there is a smart wall map on the Customs and Border Patrol website, but it has changed frequently and it has had some pretty drastic changes. Is there a formal concrete plan in place currently that local officials are all aware of, like a fully planned out map?
There is. So let me back up a little bit as far as, so when you look at Texas versus New Mexico, Arizona, and California, those three states that I mentioned, New Mexico, Arizona, and
Mhm.
California, when I started in the Border Patrol, it was nothing more than a 5-strand barbed wire fence that separated the United States from Mexico. There is no natural barrier there like we have here in Texas with the Rio Grande River. Of course, the Rio Grande River makes up our border with Mexico, right from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville. It's 1,200 miles. Texas has 3/4 of the U.S.-Mexico border, almost 3/4. Um, but with
Mhm.
that being said, when we first started barrier, it was in those um, urban to urban environments, Nogales to Nogales, El Paso to Juarez, San Diego to Tijuana. There was a need to slow down people crossing the border, so we started building barriers. But we all know that barriers don't stop people. It either deters them or it slows them down. It gives Border Patrol the advantage, the tactical advantage to be able to move into areas, make those apprehensions before people mix in with legitimate traffic. I started my Border Patrol career under President Clinton. I worked through President Bush, through President Obama, through President Trump, and a portion of Biden. And I don't like to, in any interview I do, I shoot straight. I don't try to curtail it to one news agency or one political party. I am who I am and a career Border Patrol agent. So my story stays the same. But those first 4 administrations all added more infrastructure, such as fence. So back with Bill Clinton, we first started building border infrastructure, fencing, lighting. They all added more technology, cameras along the border, and most importantly, they all added men and women wearing a badge to go out there and successfully do the job.
Mhm.
Under the Biden administration, we saw a complete dismantling of the border. And with President Trump coming back in office, he didn't do anything special or secret. He just was someone that was in control of America, that has a strong voice. It could have been you, it could have been me. Anybody with a strong voice that goes in the White House and lets the rest of the world know we're going to enforce our laws, it's going to have that impact. Will people still try to cross? They certainly will. People are still trying to cross, just not in the numbers that we saw. We're at extremely low numbers. However, um, getting to more specific on your question, when the Big Bend Wall first started being talked about, I think it was about February, March. It was initially rolled out by Kristi Noem, and she was the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I can tell you that she had to put Minneapolis, New Orleans, Charlotte, Chicago, and LA in her rearview mirror because those were all disasters. We have never enforced interior immigration enforcement as the way she did. And I like to say that we were actually deploying law enforcement, Border Patrol agents, and ICE agents in a political manner rather than a tactical manner. And unfortunately, we had agents and officers get hurt, and unfortunately, we had American citizens die. Horrible thing. So she wanted to put that in a rearview mirror. She wanted to put the focus back on the border and looked at a spot where we had never built any type of border wall infrastructure, and that's here in the Big Bend. The Big Bend sector runs from Hudspeth County down to Terrell County. It includes obviously Presidio County and Brewster County, and a small portion of Culberson. And let me get back on my train of thought. So when she announced her plan was to build a 30-foot barrier from Hudspeth all the way to Terrell County, makes no sense. And I can tell you, having spent 11 years as the patrol agent charge and being one of the sector leaders, we never planned for any type of infrastructure other than a few spots where we do have locations closer to Hudspeth and Presidio counties where the Rio Grande River goes underground, and you have the ability to drive a car across the river. So that would necessitate a vehicle barrier. The plan for out here in Terrell County is to build a vehicle barrier from one end to the other. And if you were to come out and look at the river here, the river canyon, there's not a place you can drive a car across the river. So it makes no sense. But going back to when she first announced this, she'd actually circumvented Rodney Scott, and he's the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. He's also a friend of mine. We worked in Nogales together. He promoted up to Washington, D.C. and took me with him. And we have this long lasting working relationship. We still communicate. We communicate on what's going on now. But she circumvented him because he was a career official that told her, and her being a political appointee, he's a political appointee. However, she had no experience. He'd been the U.S. Border Patrol's whole career. He tried to let her know, along with some others, that the way they were getting ready to conduct operations in those cities I mentioned was not going to end well, and we certainly saw that. So, whenever she was removed by President Trump into her new position, um, it gave Rodney Scott that voice again, and he did change the plans for what's transpiring here in the Big Bend. I still don't fully agree with it. It's better than what it was, but I think there's still changes that can be made. And again, me having not only did I work in Sanderson, I can tell you I spent about a year and a half in Sierra Blanca, the furthest west station of the Big Bend sector. I worked in Alpine Station as a field operations supervisor, which is the second level of supervision. It encompasses the Big Bend National Park. And as I mentioned, I worked in Terrell County. So I worked in the furthest west, the furthest east, and right in the center. I can tell you what will work in this sector. I can tell you what we plan for, and I still get out and use the technology that Border Patrol has deployed today. So to the last part of your question, yes, we're now seeing machinery roll into Big Bend National Park, and that's because it's a federally owned piece of land, right? So they can start working in there right away. The portions from Presidio upriver to Hudspeth County and from Brewster County out to my county, they're still having to work with landowners to get agreements to come in and whatnot. So they haven't wrapped all that up, and it's probably going to take quite a while for them. And that's why they're starting to work down in Big Bend. And I tell you, we have had meetings with CBP. They've invited the judges and sheriffs over, and there is a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of a false narrative. They've assured us they're not putting the lighting in Big Bend National Park. They're not putting a 30-foot barrier. They do plan to do some road improvements, put some new roads, and also some technology. Um, but again, what we're seeing, you know, we truly believe, well, the people that are going to suffer from that somewhat are, of course, landowners in the areas outside the park, business owners in those areas outside the park, um, people that own livestock, some of the wildlife where that 30-foot barrier will keep them from the river. Um, and what I like to really say is, that part where they're going to, in Hudspeth and Presidio County, where they're going to put the 30-foot barrier, that area is what's served for that vehicle barrier rather than putting it out here in my county. All we need is more technology and more boots on the ground and some road improvements. Out west is where they really need that vehicle barrier to prevent vehicles from driving across the border. But what I will say is that area from Presidio, Texas to Ojinaga, Chihuahua, that urban to urban environment, the only urban and urban environment, and that 517-mile stretch of border with Mexico is likely where we would need some 30-foot barrier. Again, is it going to stop people? No, but it will certainly slow them down and give Border Patrol agents um, that advantage of a reaction time. Now, saying that, and behind me, I have a map of the Big Bend sectors. The green parts that you see on the United States side, those are natural barriers. We have out in the Hudspeth County, we have the Quitman Mountains, the Eagle Mountains. When you move into Presidio Mountains or Presidio County, we have what we call the Rim that run down to the Shenandoah Mountains. And then, of course, in the actual Big Bend region, Big Bend National Park, Big Bend Ranch State Park, Black Gap Wildlife Management Area, and then the lower canyons of the Rio Grande, which encompasses Terrell County. Those are those natural barriers. I like to call them God-made barriers that we have that help really deter traffic already. And I can take you down here to the border in Terrell County where we have 500,000-foot cliffs, and I can show you where people will still cross that. But if they're going to cross a 500-foot cliff and arrive at a 30-foot barrier, that's not going to stop them, especially if we're going to use eminent domain to take sovereign American soil, cede it to Mexico along with the Rio Grande River. And because the river isn't a straight line, it zigs, it zags, it twists and turns. There's going to have to be a significant amount of land taken. And once we give it to Mexico, those smugglers are going to take advantage of it by hiding a 31-foot ladder in order to cross President Trump's 30-foot wall.
As you mentioned, certain land features are being taken into account with certain styles of barriers, a vehicle barrier versus actual wall versus additional surveillance. I know you've spoken extensively before about using non-invasive technology wherever possible. What kind of features or like what does that non-invasive technology look like in certain
Right.
places, and what would dictate that being used over other barriers?
Great. So again, great question. So out here in Terrell County and throughout Big Bend sector, and as well as along the southwest border, currently we have Anduril, which is a national defense company. They build a tower called an autonomous surveillance tower, AST tower, and
Mhm.
that tower it's about a 20-foot staff. A pole. It's got a camera on top as well as a radar on top, and that radar is built. It has AI in it to where it just sits there in the radar spinning, looking for a human walking. It detects the human gait, the way a human walks. It won't stop for an animal. It's programmed to avoid focusing on animals, avoid focusing on vehicles. It's trained just to look at the human gait. So extremely effective. They have about a 5 mile range that they can see circumference. So every 5 miles or so, you need to put one. But they have night and daytime camera, and it no longer when I first came in the Border Patrol, we had cameras in those urban environments, but you had a computer screen or a TV screen, and you had cameras, and you had a joystick, and it took a human sitting there looking for people crossing, right? And we had that night vision and day vision. Well, now the computer system does it all, and when it detects somebody, it sends an alert to another computer where you have the in-house supervisor there at the Border Patrol station, and as soon as it alerts him, then he takes over. He decides what cameras it's at, and then he radios to the agents in the field and sends them to that area. Works great. And then it doesn't take electricity. It doesn't take propane. It's like a 25 yard by 25 yard base setup um, that runs off solar energy. So it leaves a very small footprint in nature. And then coupled with that, we have what we call mobile video surveillance system. And basically, it's the same type of technology in the back of a pickup truck that goes out in the field. It can be used in day or night, and it has a radar, it has a camera, and it's used by an agent. But what that does is it allows us to get into areas where there may be a canyon or a mountain in the way, and we can readjust and refocus on those groups. And then the one I really like to tout is the Predator B drones that are what we use in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were finally turned over from national defense to federal law enforcement, and they were armed instead of with missiles, they were armed with radars and cameras. That same concept that I've explained on the autonomous surveillance towers, and they fly at about 27,000 feet, and they are hard to beat. But the problem is we only have two locations on the southwest border, one in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which is in Sierra Vista, and the other location, San Angelo. And they split up the border. So from El Paso, Texas to San Diego, the one out of Arizona flies. The one here in Texas flies from Big Bend sector all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley. And of course, since the Big Bend region doesn't have as much activity as other locations, it spends most of its time in those other locations. However, when it does fly here, and we do get a little bit of it, we get a little flight time from it, it's extremely effective, and it assists us in making those apprehensions. With that being said, it can also um, provide persistent surveillance, meaning it can just fly circles and keep an eye on the group until agents get there. And then if the group scatters, which a lot of times the people will run because they don't want to be caught because they've been through so much. So it can
Mhm.
sit there on site and then lead agents through radio communications on where the people are. Works extremely well. Um, and then we also use game cameras. It's a sensor, a smaller sensor package out in the field that when someone crosses its path, it sends us a picture and lets us know that somebody's in that specific area. Now, that's improved from what we used to have, which was seismic sensors, which vibrated. When someone stepped over, it sent a vibration and radio signal back to the station to let us know somebody was in that area. But without having a camera attached to it, we'd have to send an agent maybe a 30 miles down the road, but it takes you 2.5 hours to get there to find out it was animals. So by the time you drive back, you spend almost a whole shift checking to validate whether it was a person or an animal. Where now, again, camera technology gives us that instant notification. So technology works great. The next point I'll make is, of course, during the Biden administration, myself, Rodney Scott, again, who's commissioner of CBP, Tom Holman, we all know who he is, Chris Clem, a retired chief patrol agent. A lot of us would cry out that border security equals national security. Let me say that again. You can clean it up and I know cut and paste it, but border security does equal national security. However, we're still not treating border security like national security, and that doesn't mean militarizing the border, sending troops to the border, and it doesn't mean necessarily putting military equipment on the border. What it means is using that national level technology that we use overseas in wars and whatnot on our own borders. And it's not spying on Americans. It's not spying on Mexicans. It's keeping an eye on the U.S.-Mexico border. I know there's better technology that's out there that we could certainly utilize to help make the U.S.-Mexico border more safe and secure, as well as the northern border.
And I have one question before I ask the last question,
Okay.
and it has to do with wildlife management. I know that there's currently a lawsuit from the Center for Biological Diversity against Customs and Border Patrol, or that may not be the correct agency, but there's a lot of environmental groups concerned about wildlife. Is there any plan for managing wildlife that usually inhabits both sides of the border?
I spent 10 years of my border patrol career out in Arizona. And again, I explained how in those urban to urban environments is where we initially put the fence. And of course, outside those cities, there in communities on the border, there was nothing more than a 5-strand barbed wire fence that divided Mexico and the United States. And what would happen is once we got more successful in controlling those communities, people would start going further out in the desert, crossing the fence, and it's same with narcotics traffickers. They would load 5 vehicles, loaded each with 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of marijuana, and shoot or drive 5 vehicles across the border. If we got one, they were successful because they got 4 got away, and they kind of build that loss into their business plan. We needed a way to secure that 5-strand barbed wire fence, so we started building the vehicle barriers. Um, but they have Customs and Border Protection has since started building, of course, as we know, throughout Arizona, throughout California, throughout New Mexico, the 30-foot barrier fence, which has cut off a lot of the wildlife that has historically traversed both sides of the border. What I'll speak to is the jaguars in Arizona. We still have jaguars that come out of Sonora, Mexico, and go into that southeastern portion of Arizona, and it's cut off its normal migratory path. Out here in Texas, we have bears, we have mountain lions, we have aoudad sheep, and other wildlife that are threatened to be cut off as well. And CBP told us that they'll put these fences in there that the wildlife can go back and forth. But I have people that I still communicate with out in Arizona that say that those fences or those little, for lack of little gates, don't really work. Um, and I'll tell you, if I'm all for border security, I'm for building barriers where barriers work. And if we had a problem out here that necessitated us building a 30-foot barrier, I'd be all for it. But again, I've worked these areas. I know these mountain ranges. I know the lay of the land, and I can tell you by just deploying the right technology, adding more manpower, giving border patrol agents improved roads in some of these areas, because when we get into our rainy season, there's a lot of areas we can't access because the roads, because of the soil, become just basically a mud pit, and you'll get stuck. So that they can build these all-weather roads. We've used those in other states as well, but that's the technology infrastructure we need. And again, no matter how much technology you put out on the border, whether it's autonomous surveillance towers, drones, MVSS is the mobile video surveillance systems, if you don't have enough men and women with a badge on their chest, that technology is just what we say counting gotaways. It's watch people cross the border illegally, and if there's no one to chase them, then it's doing us no good. So we have to have that right combination of the technology and manpower.
And I think my final question is about any of the secondary effects this has had on the community. I've seen on Facebook that there have been some instances of um, people denying business to contractors in the area because it's become such a heated issue. Are there any other secondary effects that the local communities have seen in that area of
Most definitely.
action?
There have been other effects in the local communities out here in Sanderson, not as much, although we do have a business owner that runs our local hotel that says their business has dropped pretty significantly this year, and they wonder if it's because of all the talk down in Big Bend about building the wall, and less tourism's happening. Those people that rely on river tours, or river excursions, jeep excursions, hiking excursions that live off the tourism down in Big Bend, they'll tell you that because of all the chatter that they are seeing less people come out, and they're trying to get out ahead of it and tell people the park is still open. You can still come out and see the river. But I know recently with some of that construction that's going on, they are closing several roads in order to start the construction. So that's limiting access to certain parts of the park.
Mhm.
A lot of people make their livelihood off the Rio Grande River and tourism down in the Big Bend area. and they're the ones that are really suffering the most. But not only do they suffer, but we have to factor in the taxes that are generated, the revenue that's generated that goes back into those communities, into those counties. That's also being disrupted as well. I would think that's probably the biggest at this point. And then, of course, if American citizens have to lose part of their ranch due to eminent domain, then that will certainly be another blow that our communities will suffer.
Mm. Well, Sheriff Cleveland, thank you so much for sitting down with me and
You bet.
answering all these questions.
Anytime.
I
You're
appreciate all of your knowledge and experience, of course, in the subject.
Thank you. And you're welcome to come out anytime, when if things progress or when they progress, if you want to come out and kind of see what it's like, open invitation to you.